Today I'm rummaging through my collection of F1 games to dig out and play every game released on what I consider to be one of the best consoles of all time, the almighty Sega Mega Drive, or indeed the Genesis if you prefer. We'll also include CD and 32X games too, so keep an eye out for those towards the end of the video. So, if you were to count up how many F1 games have been released over the years, it's quite a lot. I have here a massive spreadsheet which I use to catalogue my collection, detailing every game physically released on every format across every region of the world. Yes, I know I need to get a life. If you're interested though, I have a video exploring the whole collection, so if you'd like to see that, or if you're just generally interested in racing games, sim racing or F1, please consider a like and subscribe to the channel. It'd really help me to grow and reach more people. Anyway, as I was saying, if you count up every F1 or F1 style game ever released, there's around just under 700 individual titles released worldwide. Of these, 39 games were released on the Sega Mega Drive, Mega CD and 32X formats combined. Within these 39 titles, and removing regional duplicates and re-releases under different names, there are 17 unique games for us to explore today. We'll be running through them in chronological order from 1990 to 1995, which means we'll be starting with one of the very best, Super Monaco GP. Releasing in the arcades in 1989 and making its way to home consoles a year later, Super Monaco GP is the most re-released game on this list, with no less than 11 versions overall, thanks mainly to its inclusions on multi-game pack-in cartridges such as the Mega Games collections. In fact, across all formats and regions there's 40 different editions of this one single title. I actually still need to get 2 more versions of the game to complete my set, so if anyone out there has a copy of Mega Games 10, which I think was Japan and Brazil, or the Mega Hits variants of the game, and is willing to sell it for a lot less than eBay right now, please let me know. Considering this is the first game of its kind on the console, it holds up extremely well for a 35-year-old game, and much better than some of what's coming up later in this list. While it's not officially licensed, it represented all the F1 tracks from the era, and was way ahead of its time with driver rivalries, team changes, and a full multi-season World Championship to compete in, and remains one of my favourite games of all time to this day. In 1991, the Mega Drive received 3 F1 games, but all exclusively in Japan only. Firstly, we have F1 Circus MD. Now, brace yourself because this game is not great. The menus are fine, and the feature set is pretty good with variable car setups, time trials and championship game modes. There's a good amount of stuff to do. Unfortunately, while the top-down art style looks quite decent, it renders the game almost impossible to play on account of the speed at which the track comes at you. It might just be that I don't have the reflexes anymore, but capturing footage for this game was a real pain in the backside as I could barely keep the car on the track. The directional arrows for turns appear and disappear faster than my brain can read them, and glancing at the minimap just induced a crash any time I looked across at it. Up next, with one of my favourite box art graphics, Fastest 1. Now, anyone who was there back in the 90s will at some point have fallen foul of the allure of great box art to then be massively disappointed with what the actual game looks like. Fastest 1 is a perfect example of this. It looks no better than Super Monaco GP on the Sega Master System. In fact, I suspect this was originally made with 8-bit consoles in mind, and then hastily ported onto a newer format without much thought, because it's not exactly showcasing the power of the console. Also, look at how narrow the actual gameplay window is here. With an output resolution of 320 by 240 pixels, you play this entire game in a letterbox of less than 80 pixels. It's ridiculous. But please stick with me as we have still got some actually good games still to come. But not yet. Here's Nakajima Satoru's F1 Grand Prix. Very similar in terms of its feature set to F1 Circus, but with improved graphics and an official license from FOCA, we get some real team names and drivers, not least Nakajima Satoru himself, who must have had a brilliant agent at the time who secured him 2 licensed product deals in this year and the next, despite his 5-year career delivering a season best result of only 12th and an average finishing position of 13th across his 77 races. The following year, however, Satoru's game got a fast-tracked sequel with F1 Super License. Almost a cut and paste of the last game, however this time there were just enough improvements to make it actually quite enjoyable to play. A solid effort on the front end and menus made a big difference. Then, a slightly better camera view and more responsive controls plus better timed directional indicators made Super License actually quite fun to play. Again, I'm sorry for my poor gameplay capture here, it still remains a tad too twitchy for my liking, but I think this is the best of the top-down games on the console. I do worry for when I come to the Super NES and Super Famicom versions of these videos, as there's about 20 top-down games on those, but we'll worry about that later. 1992 also saw the first example of a game released in two regions under two different names. Known as F1 Hero MD in Japan and released as Ferrari Grand Prix Challenge in Europe and America, this is another example of a game aiming to replicate the success of Super Monaco and not quite succeeding. The game holds a license from Fokker according to the box, but I'm not sure who Ayrton Senna is. Oh, and here's Alain Prest in his Ferrari? Yes, in the game which is literally called Ferrari Challenge. Anyway, onto the gameplay and, well, it's not the best. Remember, Super Monaco was made 3 years earlier than this. This is pretty basic, with sluggish controls and pretty awful audio, and aside from not being a top-down viewpoint, there's very little to recommend about this game. Considering the alternative games available for Sega owning F1 fans at the time, I'm amazed this game is as common as it is. It's all been a bit negative so far, but thankfully Sega are going to fix that with some help from the greatest driver of all time, Mr. Ayrton Senna, and Super Monaco Grand Prix 2. Fresh from winning the F1 Championship in 1991, this game set a new standard on the console. Rather surprisingly, the game didn't iterate much on the original game which came 2 years before, and without an actual F1 license, it was a little weird to see Senna racing against a bunch of fake name drivers, but the gameplay, visuals and audio made sure that this game remained top tier in the Mega Drive and Genesis catalogue. Not to be outdone, Nigel Mansell also needed a video game after winning his championship, so in 1993 we got the ambitiously named Nigel Mansell's World Championship Racing. This game released on virtually every console format available at the time, but strangely with some variations between them. Despite being on similarly powered consoles, the Super NES version of the game features a slightly different menu structure and a first-person viewpoint, almost a copy of the successful Monaco formula. Here on the Mega Drive we get a somewhat inferior third-person viewpoint, which personally I found harder to control. These pseudo 3D games built with 2D scaling graphics all seem to suffer from a similar problem. As the opponent cars transition from smaller to larger sprites as they get closer, they inevitably cause slow-brained people like me to crash into them more often. Cars appear so wide when you're next to them it's almost impossible to overtake without contact. The game remains quite playable today, but I've always preferred the SNES version overall. An official license and decent soundtrack made the game stand out though, and I can't be too harsh on a game endorsed by my favourite driver. 2 more games still to go in 1993, and chances are most people know this one well. Domark's original Formula 1, based on the original game Vroom made by the French studio Lancourt. This game fully embraced its official FIA endorsement with an almost complete complement of official tracks and drivers and support for up to 4 players. Time trials, full seasons and a satisfying amount of car setup options ensured the game modes were plentiful, but it's the graphics that really set this apart. Monaco and Mansell had been the bar so far, but this advanced things to another level with much smoother scaling, believable track undulations and much more detailed trackside scenery that reflected the real F1 tracks. Handling is crisp and still holds up by today's standards. I have fond memories of this game as it was the very last game I purchased for my Mega Drive before I swapped the console with a friend at school for a SNES with Mario Kart, but that's a story for another video. 1993 was also the year that Europe and America were blessed with the start of the next generation of video games in the form of the mighty Mega CD. The Mega CD add-on launched at £270 in the UK, which in today's money is £585 or $790, and unsurprisingly wasn't a massive seller, despite some really cool features such as CD quality audio and full motion video capability. Our first Mega CD title on this list is F1 Circus CD. Considering that game presentation was a big selling point of the Mega CD format, the menus in F1 Circus CD are, well, terrible. However, things get better as you can choose to play with F1 cars from different eras, such as the cigar-shaped chassis, try saying that 3 times, and high-winged vehicles. Gameplay is really solid too, but I found the constant bobbing of the car can be a little distracting. Also, once again we have that common problem of cars being so wide that it's almost impossible to overtake them. That said, for a 16-bit game you can really tell they've used the extra horsepower of the format to deliver a higher frame rate and a smoother sprite scaling effect. Still, not everyone could afford to sell their house to buy a Mega CD, so for the standard Mega Drive there was still plenty of games on the horizon. Within my F1 collection, I do make some exceptions for, let's call them F1 adjacent titles, so I couldn't not include Newman Haas Indycar featuring Nigel Mansell. All the standard game modes you'd expect are present and correct, but once you get to the track you do notice a drop in presentation standards compared to the other games released around this time. But once things start moving, the controls are actually brilliant, possibly the best seen in this type of viewpoint in any game on this list. Tracks are wide and the weight of the car feels quite realistic, and it's pleasant to drive on the tracks you don't normally see in the F1 games, for obvious reasons. In 1993, the video game industry was preparing to explode, with news of new hardware from Nintendo, Sony, and just about every electronics manufacturer on the planet, and arcades were now showcasing games developed with true 3D graphics. Step forward, Virtua Racing. Or, in the case of the Mega Drive, a bit of a stumble backwards. You see, Virtua Racing in the arcades was incredible, the absolute cutting edge of what was possible at the time. Porting a brand new 1993 arcade game to a console launched in 1988, which held none of the internal architecture capable of running such a game, ended up looking like this. Appalling frame rate, even worse resolution, and while yes it did sort of look like Virtua Racing, it was borderline unplayable with extremely twitchy controls, and the terrible draw distance meant it required the reflexes of an actual F1 driver to survive the tracks as the corners magically appeared out of nowhere. Still, a great indication of the potential for racing games in the future, and it would be much improved with a 32X version, which we'll get to shortly. Back to the Mega CD now with this game from 1994, known as Formula 1 World Championship Beyond the Limit in the West, but in Japan has quite possibly the greatest name ever for an F1 game, Heavenly Symphony. Ironically, the Western version of the game had the best soundtrack though, as you're going to hear in the full intro movie coming up next. Apologies in advance for the grainy footage and crackly audio, this was captured directly from original hardware, but 30 years ago, this was as good as it got. FIA F1 licence for the 1993 season with all the usual game modes you'd expect, but also some race-specific challenges based on real-world events, such as taking on Damon Hill and Michael Schumacher after a safety car restart at a wet Interlagos. Graphically, it's quite similar to F1 Circus CD, with enhanced frame rates and better scaling, but overall is still hampered by 2D game design and the limits of the original 16-bit hardware the game is forced to work from. The game has some slight regional variances too, with menu graphics and weirdly swaps the HUD from top to bottom in different versions. Just like many Mega CD games, it seems to be more about the presentation rather than the gameplay, which is a bit of a shame. As Sega struggled between its American and Japanese counterparts arguing over the development of their 32-bit Saturn console, we got another stopgap hardware add-on for the Mega Drive in the form of the 32X. This weird mushroom thing finally delivered 32-bit graphics chips to the Mega Drive, and while I'm not smart enough to understand how that works, it does mean we got an upgraded and rather good home version of Virtua Racing. This deluxe edition of the game contained more car types and more tracks, and was better than the dismal standard Mega Drive version in every way. Faster frame rate, higher resolution, faster gameplay, smoother overall made the game finally playable in a home setting. This would certainly have felt next-gen at the time. The only problem now was that the 32-bit consoles were just around the corner, featuring games like Daytona USA and Ridge Racer, making the lifespan of the 32X and Virtua Racing itself a lot shorter than it deserves to be. And so, we come to the final F1 game released on the Sega Mega Drive, F1 World Championship Edition, released in 1995. No additional hardware required, this game released on the vanilla Mega Drive, plus other aging formats at the time, into a world which was now experiencing true 3D gaming, and so had to deliver something special, and thankfully it did. A more up-to-date license showcased the 1994 season with all 16 tracks with tight handling and refinements to the already top-level game that came before it. As far as F1 games go, for me, this was as good as it ever got on the Mega Drive. We certainly saw some bad games along the way, but without these stepping stones we likely wouldn't have sim racing as good as we have it today. And that completes our list of every F1 game released on the Sega Mega Drive, Genesis, Mega CD and 32X. There's still more Sega formats to explore of course, such as the SG-3000, Master System, Saturn and Dreamcast, and of course there's no shortage of other formats to look at, so please do let me know if you'd like to see anything specific for a future video like this. Thank you so much for watching, please do consider subscribing if you like this sort of thing, and perhaps I shall see you on another video. Bye for now.